Welcome to FoxNews.com. I'm KT McFarland. Zelda la Grange grew up in South Africa in a white Afrikaner family that supported the rules of apartheid and referred to the then imprisoned Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. Yet just a few years after his release and the end of apartheid in the early 1990s, she went from being a government secretary to one of Nelson Mandela's most loyal and devoted associates. She shares her journey in the book, Good Morning, Mr. Mandela. Thank you so much, Zelda, for coming on FoxNews.com. Let me ask you, we've all seen the movies and the pictures of the white South African government with de Klerk as president, and Nelson Mandela is elected. De Klerk and the whites move out of the office, and Nelson Mandela walks through the door with the new black staff. You stayed. What made you decide to stay?
Well, I applied for a job in his office in 1994 only, although I worked for the previous government, but in a department not connected with the president's office. So I applied for this job in 1994, and you know what Nelson Mandela wanted to do is to really show the rest of the world that we are an embraced society now. We're going to embrace even the people who represented apartheid and the previous regime. For him, I epitomized the Afrikaner, the young Afrikaner. I was available to commit and dedicate myself to him, and he recognized that, and that was necessary for the job. And that's how it all came about, that I ended up spending 19 years with him. Yeah,
but you've got to remember back to that time. Did you, and I'm sure a lot of your family and friends, they must have been very skeptical whether Nelson Mandela, despite the good speeches, whether he could really pull it off?
Absolutely. We all had our doubts. The first day I met him, and that's why I also chose the title of this book, when I faced him for the first time, you must remember I was brought up to believe that this man is the enemy. He represented fear in my eyes, yet he extended his hand to me. He spoke to me in Afrikaans, my home language, the language of the oppressor. He opened himself up to me, and it was with kindness and sincerity that he met me. And that made me think that maybe everything I had been brought up to believe was not the truth. So he slowly brought about change, and over the years I've watched him. He always said it's easier to change other people than it is to change yourself. So you have to start with the self, and I had to start with admitting that I needed to change.
Well, tell me what it was the country felt at the time. I mean, you and your family and your friends, they must have looked at you and potentially even thought, well, she's betrayed us. She's going to work, like you said, for the enemy, the terrorists. And yet at the same time, the black Africans must have looked and thought, wow, it's revenge time. It's payback time. We're going to get back at them and do to them what they did to us. I mean, what was the country like at the time in 1994?
Well, very tense, and you are absolutely right in describing it. We were really on the verge of a civil war. And Mr. Mandela, throughout his life, gave credit to each and every South African who wanted and decided that we wanted to bring about peace in South Africa, a peaceful transition in South Africa. We obviously had great leadership from people like Mr. Mandela, the people who drafted our constitution and who negotiated the peace deal. So we were very blessed in South Africa that we were given the right leaders at the right time. But it also took concerted effort from each and every South African to rebuild this country. And Mr. Mandela always gave ordinary South Africans also credit that we didn't burn the country down to the ground.
Well, when you look at South Africa today, Nelson Mandela's been gone for a long time, and the headiness of the moment and the unbelievable success that he and President de Klerk had in making that transition for a generation of Africans and Afrikaners, that's over now, and South Africa stands on its own. What are you doing today to keep that legacy alive, in that sense that we're all in this together to make a country that represents all people?
You're asking a very interesting question. We find ourselves, like I think many places in the world, in a very interesting time where we are grappling with racial issues again. The great thing about this book of mine is that people from both sides of the political divide has reached out to me to say we need to be reminded of the life and the lessons Nelson Mandela has left us, to remind ourselves where we come from and to prevent ourselves from going back there. So I think, in where we are right now, 7 months after Mr. Mandela's death, it's perhaps time, that people across the world, not only South Africans, but people across the world, try and comprehend the true value of this man's legacy of peace, of his humanitarian efforts, and perhaps it could help us deal with current issues.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Zelda la Grange, who was a trusted advisor to Nelson Mandela in one of the most critical times, probably in African history, but certainly in South African history. She's the author of the new book, Good Morning, Mr. Mandela. Thanks so much for joining us, Zelda, and I hope the book does really well and the message you're trying to portray and give to the world is heard by all.